It's a delight to have you here for such an important topic. Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, the biggest selling historian in the world today, a British intellectual, not a Christian, recently said that Christians and Christianity should stay weird. Christianity shouldn't water itself down as it did in the Enlightenment period and get rid of all those strange things like the virgin birth and rising from the dead and respectable Christianity. He said, and it's interesting coming from someone who's not a believer, that actually one of the most compelling things about Christianity is it stood in our world as a sign that maybe there's something beyond. Maybe there's a curtain that you could just glimpse behind, and it's a miraculous world. That strangeness about Christianity is one of its most compelling things. But is it plausible? Are miracles philosophically defensible? Well, to answer this question is a friend of mine, Max Baker Heitch. Dr. Max Baker Heitch did his DPhil, because they're such snobs at Oxford, they won't call it a PhD. The rest of us have PhDs. They have DPhils in philosophy. He then did two post-doctoral positions, one at Oxford and then at the University of Notre Dame, after which he received another position back at Oxford in the philosophy department, where he is a tutor in philosophy at Oxford University, based at Wycliffe Hall, which is a wonderful institution at the heart of Oxford University. He's published many academic papers on key problems in the philosophy of religion, including problems to do with evil and the hiddenness of God. His new book, just out this year with Cambridge University Press, is God and the Problem of Evidential Ambiguity, which basically is a high-level answer to the question, why can't I see God? Why isn't God more obvious? And he gives a philosophical analysis of it. It's a great pleasure. I've been talking with him for years about coming to Wheaton to give a talk, and I'm so glad that we're here to do it. Will you please welcome Dr. Max Baker Heitch.
Thank you so much, John. That's a very generous introduction. I'm very flattered that John remembered by heart the title of my book, which I myself often can't remember. As John said, I'm here to talk about this question of whether miracles are credible. And I don't think this is just peripheral. This is a sort of peripheral question for Christianity, right? Because at the heart of the Christian faith is a claim that a miracle occurred, that is to say the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And I think it's fair to say that perhaps more so than most other religions in the world, Christianity really does stand or fall on that central claim about that miracle that allegedly happened in time and space. So I think this is a super important topic. So I wanted to kind of get you warmed up with a little thought experiment. So a thought experiment is basically, philosophers like thought experiments. Some of them are very far-fetched, very strange scenarios. This one is actually kind of realistic. But the idea with a thought experiment is it's an imaginary scenario to focus our intuitions and kind of test certain philosophical principles. And on its face, this doesn't really have anything to do with religion, but you'll hopefully start to see the connection. Okay, so I didn't come up with this. This is actually a philosopher called Julian Baggini. He's got this book called The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten. It's a collection of these sort of thought experiments. But this one is very relevant to our topic this evening. So I'm just going to read this passage out. And basically what I want you to be thinking about is the question, does the character in this story act reasonably in what she does or does not believe? Okay, so here it goes. Dara Gupta lived all her life in a village near Jaisalmer in the Rajasthan desert of India. One day in 1822, as she was cooking dinner, she became aware of a commotion. She looked up to discover that her cousin Mahavir had returned from a trip he had begun 2 years before. He looked in good health, and over dinner he told them of his adventures. There were tales of robbers, wild animals, great mountains, and other incredible sights and adventures. But what really stunned Dara was his claim to have seen something called ice. I went to regions where it was so cold the water stopped flowing and formed a solid translucent block, said Mahavir. What is more amazing is that there is no state in between where the liquid thickens. The water that flows freely is only slightly warmer than that which has solidified. So here's the really key bit. Dara did not want to challenge her cousin in public, but she did not believe him. What he said contradicted all her experience. She did not believe it when travelers told her of fire-breathing dragons, nor would she believe this nonsense about ice. She thought she was too intelligent for that. Actually, I wonder if you would mind turning for just like 2 minutes to your next door neighbor and talking about this question. Do you think that she was reasonable to disbelieve her cousin about ice? Okay, so remember the idea is this is someone who's grown up in a time and place where she has no experience of water turning solid. It's outside her experience. She hears a report of ice and she just says, no, I disbelieve that. It doesn't fit with my prior experience of how the world works. Is that a reasonable thing for her to do? So just take literally 2 minutes to discuss some thoughts with your neighbor. Okay, I'm really glad that you guys have obviously you've found quite a lot to talk about. It sounds like this could have fallen very badly flat if the room had just gone silent. So why don't a couple of people just, if you don't mind, just kind of shout out what did you discuss? What did you conclude? If you concluded anything, does anyone want to volunteer? Yes. Not reasonable. Okay. And in a nutshell, why not?
He gave an explanation, and it may be something she didn't experience.
Yeah.
But he gave a reasonable explanation, and you can't know everything that goes on in the world.
Yeah.
So you got to be a little open.
Yep. Thank you. That seems fair. Anyone else? Yep.
I'd say she's reasonable.
Okay.
The reason why is because everything that she's ever been taught her whole life has led her to rationalize the information that she's being presented with. Though new to her, she's going through a natural process of deciphering what truth is and what's not true. And because she doesn't have anything to cross-reference it with, she's coming to this conclusion where she doesn't believe she's putting on the same realm as the dragon.
Yeah.
And therefore, I believe sort of like Alvord in the cage, which is her whole life.
Right. So there's some way in which she needs to filter this new information, and her only frame of reference is what she's previous. Thank you. Oh, that's helpful to have those two contrasting perspectives. Well, this gentleman is a famous philosopher of the Enlightenment, a Scottish philosopher, David Hume. And David Hume thought that the answer to this question was very emphatically that the woman in the thought experiment was reasonable to reject the testimony about the ice. And actually, his scenario was that he discussed in the work that I'm going to be talking about. He had this essay called On Miracles, and he discusses a case of an Indian prince who was told about the fact that water can, in some situations, turn so solid that it could support the weight of an elephant. And this is what Hume says. The Indian prince who refused to believe the first reports concerning the effects of frost reasoned justly. So David Hume is a very important figure in this conversation about miracles. Hume gave this argument, and there is, as you would expect in any kind of scholarly sort of discussion, especially when it's a historical figure where there's issues about interpreting what they really meant. There is some debate about what exactly Hume's argument was. I'm going to go with an interpretation of what Hume said that I think is fairly mainstream. And basically, it seems as though what Hume wanted to say was that, in principle, it doesn't really matter about the details of the testimony, how good the testimony is, how credible the person seems. Just because of the very kind of thing a miracle is or would be, it's so improbable that no amount of testimony can overcome that improbability. So it's never going to be reasonable to believe a miracle report. And this is what philosophers refer to as Hume's in-principle argument against miracles. He actually describes this argument as providing an everlasting check against all kinds of superstition. Pretty bold claim. So basically what I want to do in the next, 30 minutes or so is unpack the argument that Hume gave, then look at some of the objections to it. But I don't want to just kind of critique Hume. I also do think there are some valuable things we can take from him, and I want to draw those out at the end. Okay, so let's look at Hume's argument. So, as I said, I think by far the most famous philosophical argument about miracles is the argument given by Hume. And so here is a key passage from this essay in which he discusses this issue of miracle claims. So he says, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. Okay, so this needs some unpacking. What's Hume saying here? Okay, well, we can approach this by way of a fairly straightforward example. Suppose that we are learning about the way this world works, and we are letting go of objects in midair, and we find that every time we do that, the object falls to the floor. We do this hundreds and thousands of times. Every single time we release an object in midair, and it falls to the ground. So a scenario in which I let go of an object in midair and it just hovers there would be a dramatic deviation or departure from everything that we've previously experienced. According to Hume, a scenario like that would be extremely improbable. And roughly what Hume seems to think is that an event would be, the more that an alleged event would depart from what we've previously experienced, the more improbable it is that that event really happened. And so then Hume goes on to say this: no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. So philosophers sometimes call this Hume's balancing principle. So what this, in a way this is fairly common sense, but And what this principle basically says is that it's rational to accept testimony concerning a miracle only if it's even more unlikely that the testimony is mistaken than that the alleged miracle occurred. So you've probably heard the claim, and I think it was Carl Sagan who put it in this form, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It's basically saying the same thing. Now, in a moment, I'll give some examples to illustrate this principle. It's important to say Hume wasn't the first person to notice this principle, but it plays a really important role in his argument. Okay, so just stepping back a bit, actually, from the issue of miracles. When we are considering a piece of testimony, someone saying that they saw a particular event happen, there are basically two factors that we're going to weigh against each other. We don't explicitly think about it in this way normally, but I would suggest implicitly this is what we're thinking. So on the one hand, there's what we can call the intrinsic likelihood of the event. In other words, before we've encountered any direct evidence for this event, how likely should we think it is, in general, that this sort of event would occur? I know this is a bit abstract. I'm going to illustrate it in a minute with some examples. On the other hand, there's the direct evidence that the event occurred. For example, someone's testimony saying that it occurred, or a photograph that seems to show it, etc. Okay, so the basic principle is this. The bigger the circle on the left, that is to say, the more intrinsically unlikely the event, then the bigger the circle on the right, the direct evidence, needs to be in order to overcome that improbability. Okay, again, I'm going to illustrate this in a second. So when we consider whether an alleged event occurred, what we're doing, at least implicitly, is weighing the direct evidence for the event against the intrinsic unlikelihood of the event. Now, philosophers sometimes formalize this weighing up procedure mathematically using Bayes' theorem. If you're interested in that, feel free to ask me about that. I'm not going to go into that here. Suffice it to say that Bayes' theorem, I think, is really just a way of trying to make precise or more explicit something that we're already doing intuitively and implicitly. All right, so let's look at a couple of examples to flesh this out. Okay, so first example. Suppose I tell you that my wife had a cup of tea with breakfast this morning. Okay, so how intrinsically likely or unlikely is this? That's to say, before we've looked at the specific evidence that this event occurred, we're asking how likely in general is it that an event of this kind would happen in the world, right? And presumably it's not at all unlikely, right? Because, English people like to have cups of tea with breakfast. That's a very typical thing. Actually, English people love tea so much that they often, when traveling to other countries, put tea bags in little Ziploc bags to take with them because they think they won't be able to get good enough tea in other countries. I would never do that. So it's not intrinsically unlikely at all that my wife had a cup of tea with breakfast. And what that means is that the amount of direct evidence that you're going to need to make it reasonable to accept that my wife had a cup of tea is not very much at all. So suppose the evidence is just that I'm telling you my wife had a cup of tea with breakfast this morning. Suppose you don't really know anything much at all about me. You don't really know how reliable my testimony is. But because it's such an intrinsically likely event, my testimony is enough to make it reasonable for you to believe that my wife had a cup of tea. All right, let's switch to a different example where it seems that the alleged event is intrinsically very unlikely. Okay, so the example this time is that my friend John says that he saw a man levitating, okay, sitting cross-legged and literally floating above the floor, suspended in midair. Okay, so let's suppose with David Hume that intrinsically it's very, 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 very unlikely that there really was a man levitating. So in other words, before we've looked at any specific evidence that my friend John saw a man levitating. A levitation is just the kind of thing that it's very, very unlikely would occur in our world. That's the thought. So this circle on the left, this sort of big boulder of improbability, is going to make it really hard to end up, for it to be reasonable to believe this claim. So you're going to need an equivalently large boulder of positive evidence on the other side, or at least as big, to make it reasonable. And the problem is the evidence isn't very good, or it's just fairly ordinary evidence. It's just that my friend John has a photograph on his phone of someone appearing to levitate. Well, we know that it's not that difficult to doctor photos like that, and so on. So it's not reasonable to believe that the man levitated. Okay, does that make some kind of sense? Good. So I think that this is basically the heart of what's going on in Hume's argument. So you've got really two claims. One is that miracles, just because of the kinds of thing they are intrinsically extremely improbable. So that circle on the left is massive. And then we've got the claim that the seesaw has to tip to the right for you to be reasonable in believing it. The positive evidence has to be at least as big as the boulder on the left. And Hume's claim is that no amount of testimony is going to be enough. So let me try and lay out Hume's argument then in steps. So the first premise, or the first step of the argument, says that testimony to an alleged event should be believed only if the testimonial evidence is strong enough to outweigh the intrinsic unlikelihood of the event. So this is the balancing principle, right? The principle that says that the seesaw, if you like, has to tip to the right for it to be reasonable to believe that the miracle occurred. Okay, the second premise says that testimony to a miraculous event is never going to be strong enough. It's always going to be more likely that the testimony is mistaken than that the miracle occurred, because a miracle would be a deviation or departure from everything that has been previously experienced, everything that's happened before. That really should say everything that's happened before in our experience of the world. And so it would be maximally improbable. And so the conclusion then is that testimony to a miraculous event should never be believed. I'll just leave that up there for a moment for you to digest that. So, as I said earlier, this argument has been extremely influential, far beyond the walls of the academy. And in fact, even though perhaps you wouldn't necessarily associate the name of David Hume with something like this line of reasoning, I think it's a line of reasoning that has worked its way into all sorts of fields of academia, but even popular culture as well. And I think many of the new atheist authors who were very popular around the early 2000s were putting forward this type of reasoning with respect to things like the virgin birth, the resurrection, and so on. And as I said, that slogan from Carl Sagan, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, that's basically the first premise of this argument. And so yeah, in terms of the influence of Hume's argument, Ernst Troeltsch was a German biblical scholar in the late 19th and early 20th century, and he advocated a principle that was very influential in German so-called higher biblical criticism that seems pretty heavily indebted to Hume. I think you'll agree that this quote has significant kind of resonance with what Hume was saying. So Troeltsch says that the present and the past belong to the same world. Therefore, the events of the past must be fundamentally analogous to those of the present. So you remember I said that Hume thinks that the reason miracles are so intrinsically improbable is because they deviate so much from the rest of our experience. And so Troeltsch is fundamentally affirming something like that line of reasoning. He's saying that the present and the past have to be analogous to each other. If we experience a world today in which we're not seeing people, being miraculously healed in the way the Gospels depict and so on, then we shouldn't think that this kind of thing happened in the past either. Now, interestingly, this gentleman, Craig Keener, is a highly respected New Testament scholar, at Asbury Theological Seminary, I think. He has almost kind of turned that line of reasoning on its head and said, okay, fine, let's grant Troeltsch the idea that the past has to resemble the present. And Keener makes the case, of course there's room for debate about this, but Keener makes the case that the modern world does contain lots of credible miracle reports, first-hand reports from credible eyewitnesses, and he meticulously documents that in this big 2-volume work. Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar who perhaps is the most famous New Testament scholar today. Now, that's not necessarily to say that within the Guild of New Testament Scholarship he's highly influential. I mean, he does have his particular area where he's a respected scholar, but I think outside of the walls of the academy, Bart Ehrman is arguably the most influential New Testament scholar at the moment. And Ehrman has quite explicitly endorsed an attitude towards miracle claims that looks very much like what David Hume says. So Ehrman has written that any other scenario, that's to say any other scenario besides a miracle actually happening, is more likely than the one in which a great miracle occurred, since the miracle defies all probability, or else we wouldn't call it a miracle. Okay, so I want to now turn then to looking at some problems with Hume's argument. So not surprisingly, there's a large body of scholarly literature on Hume's argument, so we can only look at a few highlights. Okay, so here's one worry that has been put forward concerning Hume's argument, namely that it contains a certain kind of circular reasoning. So what Hume is basically doing is pitting two bodies of evidence against each other. Okay, so on the one side, the enormous body of observations of the world always behaving a certain way, so dead people always staying dead, for example. And on the other side, this lone little bit of testimony claiming that in one instance, the world behaved in a very different way, claiming, for instance, that a certain dead person came back to life. And it's crucial for Hume's argument, clearly, that the laws of nature have been established by, as he puts it, a firm and unalterable experience. Or in other words, it's crucial for his argument that previous experience of the world really has been completely uniform. But the difficulty with this is that Hume only gets to portray our previous experience of the world as completely uniform if he cuts out miraculous testimony before the argument has even begun. And so that's the sense in which the argument looks like it could be circular. And I think one of Hume's contemporaries, George Campbell, put it quite well when he said that, "I leave it to Hume to explain with what consistency he can assert that the laws of nature are established by a uniform experience, and that experience is chiefly the result of testimony." In other words, it's not like I have all of these experiences, going back thousands of years. That is kind of, I've received it through testimony. And at the same time allow that all human histories are full of the reports of miracles and prodigies, which are the violations of those laws. So I think Campbell's basically saying, in a way, Hume's trying to have it both ways. He wants to say that previous experience of the world is uniform. We always observe dead people staying dead. And that's this sort of boulder of evidence on the one side. and then this tiny little p of evidence saying that this one particular man didn't stay dead. The problem is, for Hume to portray that on this side as completely uniform experience of the world, he has to exclude all of the testimonies to miracles, which elsewhere Hume wants to say human cultures are full of these testimonies. Okay, let's look at a different worry. So I said that when we're considering whether to believe someone's testimony that an event occurred, we're basically weighing two things against one another. So on the one side, the intrinsic likelihood of that event, how likely or unlikely it is in general that such a thing might happen, on the one side. And then on the other side, the strength of the direct evidence for the alleged event. Okay, for example, the testimony of someone claiming they saw it, a photograph, whatever. So the direct evidence needs to be strong enough to overcome the intrinsic unlikelihood of the event. And if it's a fairly mundane event, say that my wife had tea with breakfast this morning, since that's not at all intrinsically unlikely, then only a small amount of direct evidence is needed to tip the scale to the right, okay, to make it reasonable to believe that it happened. But if it's an event that's intrinsically very unlikely, then some very strong evidence is going to be needed to make it reasonable to believe that it really happened. Okay. But a crucial question is this: what factors determine how intrinsically likely or unlikely an event is? And Hume has a very simple answer to that question. It's basically a matter of how often an event of that kind has been observed to happen in the past. And if the answer is never has that type of event happened in the past, then, according to Hume, we should think that an event of that kind is extremely intrinsically unlikely. This is a view that philosophers would call frequentism. So basically, how intrinsically likely an event is to do with how frequent it is for an event of that kind to happen in the world. Okay. So for Hume then, the likelihood of a resurrection, how intrinsically likely it is that someone would be resurrected from the dead, is simply a matter of how often dead people are resurrected. But a number of philosophers have argued that Hume is mistaken to think that the frequency of an event type is the only thing that determines the intrinsic likelihood. That there are other factors besides. And this is how the philosopher Stephen Wheaton puts it. So he says, the Achilles heel of Hume's argument is that it estimates the intrinsic improbability of an event entirely on the basis of considerations from below, by which he means by essentially statistical considerations of how often the event, when classified under a certain type, has been observed to occur. Such considerations are not irrelevant, but equally relevant are considerations from above, where we consider how expectable the event might be in the light of larger theoretical and metaphysical considerations, bringing these to bear on the full historical context of the event. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. In other words, what Wheaton is saying is that how intrinsically unlikely an event isn't just a matter of how often an event of that kind has happened in the past. It's also a matter of, if you like, bigger picture issues about concerning what sort of universe we're living in, and not least whether there's a God who might be interested in intervening in history to bring about an event that wouldn't happen if the world was just left to get on with its own business, right? Because when you think about it, if there is a God, one of the best ways for God to decisively communicate to us his existence and his purposes would be to bring about an event that strikingly deviates from the way the world normally works, so that it can stand out in stark contrast to an otherwise regular world. So if there was some reason to think there might be a God, then that in turn would give us some reason for expecting that the world might contain at least a few miracles, that is, a few events that strikingly deviate from the way nature normally works. Let me give you an analogy to flesh out this thought a bit. Okay, So here's the thought. Suppose you take a summer job working on a cake factory production line. I had a job, not a cake factory, I worked in a chocolate factory one summer. It was not as nice as it sounds. So imagine you're working on a cake factory production line, and your job is to put sprinkles onto fairy cakes as they come down the conveyor belt to you. Okay, and you suppose you've been working here now for weeks and weeks, and every single fairy cake that's come down the conveyor belt has been the same. Plain white icing and no writing on. Okay, so, and let's suppose you ask yourself, what's the likelihood, what's the intrinsic probability that a fairy cake with purple icing and happy birthday writing on it will come down the conveyor belt today? Is it, with Hume, a matter of how often that's happened in the past, i.e. never? That's what Hume seems to be saying it comes down to. How often have you seen this happen before? Well, you've never seen it happen before, so you should think that it's basically as improbable as anything could be that a cupcake like that would come down the conveyor belt. But that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like that's the only thing that determines how likely it is. There seem to be other factors. Suppose, for example, that you've learned that one of your co-workers further up the production line, the one responsible for icing the fairy cakes, quite likes you, and also that they know it's your birthday today and they know your favorite color is purple. Okay, so that sort of information, and that's not information about how often this has happened before, right? It's never happened before. But that sort of information about the co-worker, knowing your birthday, your favorite color and so on, and that they like you, does make it a bit more likely, not massively more likely, but it makes it a little bit more likely that something very out of the ordinary might happen today. So all that to say, the intrinsic likelihood of an event is not just a matter of how often it has happened in the past. So the intrinsic likelihood of the resurrection of Jesus is not just a matter of how often dead people come back from the dead. So given that other factors are also relevant to the intrinsic probability of miracles, so it's not just a matter of how often such events have happened in the past, then the fact that we have a huge body of past experience of the world working in regular and orderly ways doesn't by itself show that miracles are overwhelmingly improbable. Indeed, and here's a point that the 18th century author William Paley made, a miracle-working God would need there to be a backdrop of order and regularity in nature so that a miracle could stand out and be noticeable against that backdrop. So in short, how intrinsically likely miracles are depends at least in part on whether there's reason to think that there's a God. And actually, the Oxford philosopher Richard Swinburne has developed this point at length in a book where he makes a kind of hybrid sort of philosophical and historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. And a key part of his argument is the idea that if there's a God, and that's something he's made an extended case for across a whole series of books, that if there's a God, then that God might well have a reason to communicate with humanity by becoming incarnate in the form of a human being, and as he puts it, placing a signature on that life of that human being in a way that only God could do. And Swinburne argues that Jesus is the candidate who best fits the bill, based on various details about Jesus' life that would be quite widely accepted among historians who study the life of Jesus. And so Swinburne's claim is that whilst there's no reason to expect a resurrection to happen in the case of most human beings who've ever lived, there is some reason in the specific case of Jesus. So in other words, the intrinsic likelihood of a resurrection of this guy is not vanishingly low, which would mean then that the amount of direct historical evidence that would be needed to establish Jesus' resurrection wouldn't be enormous. Okay, a final sort of worry, critique that I want to consider is this. So Hume's notion of probability, some think, spells trouble for science. So remember that. We said earlier that Hume seems to think that the more that an alleged event would involve a deviation or a departure from what's gone before, the more intrinsically unlikely it is that such an event would ever happen. Or to put it another way, for Hume, the intrinsic likelihood of an event happening is a matter of how much it resembles what has happened previously. So the less that it would resemble what's happened before, the more unlikely it is that we should think that it would really happen. So if in the past, every time we've observed an object being released in midair and it's fallen towards the ground, then an event involving an object being released in midair and just kind of hovering there would be a massive deviation from what's gone before. It wouldn't resemble the past at all. And so for Hume, it's extremely improbable that such an event would really happen. And here's the worry with this. And you can maybe see how this relates to that thought experiment I presented you with at the start. The worry is that if we are to accept Hume's way of thinking about probability, then we would have to reject all sorts of striking scientific discoveries on the grounds that those discoveries involve occurrences that seem to go profoundly against how we previously thought the world worked. Okay, so let's just look at a few examples of this. So one example, the so-called gravitational lensing effect. So this is where light actually bends as it passes through the gravitational field of a massive object like a planet or star. And this is something that no one would have previously expected based on the way we'd observed the behavior of light up until then. Or another example, the so-called double slit experiment, okay, where a beam of light passes through two slits and onto a flat surface. And instead of producing what you would expect, namely 2 bars of light on the flat surface, it produces something totally different, namely what physicists call an interference pattern. And this is part of the basis for thinking that light, in some sense, is both wave and particle. A third example, one of the weirdest discoveries of all, quantum entanglement is where 2 subatomic particles interact with each other. And from then on, it's as though they're a pair of twins, each one doing exactly what the other one does at every moment. And here's the crazy part. They carry on with this twin behavior even if they end up on the opposite sides of the universe. Here's how the philosopher of science, Alan Hayek, puts it. He says that science tells us that there are events that happen so rarely that they've not yet fallen under our experience. Certain astronomical phenomena, for example, and other new phenomena may be quite commonplace and yet have gone unnoticed. And indeed, it is one of science's tasks to discover them. Put simply, if miracles are assigned or get vanishingly small probability because they are so disanalogous to our past experience, then so should these events. So the point of all this then is that there's a difficulty in Hume's idea that events that deviate significantly from what we've previously experienced should be thought of as extremely improbable and hence rejected. And the worry is that if we adopted that attitude, then we couldn't do science. And you might say, well, yes, but with these weird phenomena, we can at least repeatedly see them occur. That's true, but as Hayek points out, that there are some phenomena which we get such rare opportunities to observe that we might not get to repeat the experiment, as it were. And if we are perpetually closed to the possibility of such events, that's going to seriously limit the potential for expanding our horizons scientifically. So all the difficulties that we've been looking at pertain to this in-principle argument that Hume gives against miracle claims. So he basically is trying to show that without even looking at the details of any particular miracle claim, we should just reject all miracle claims in principle. Now, even many atheist philosophers today would contend that Hume's in-principle argument doesn't work. An atheist philosopher of science called John Earman wrote a book called Hume's Abject Failure. So yes, Hume's argument, it is difficult today, I think, to find philosophers who, at least philosophers who kind of specialize in studying Hume or this area concerning miracles, who would defend Hume's argument in a full sense. They might argue for some more qualified claim that's much weaker than the claim that all miracle claims have to be rejected in principle. But I think it is worth looking at some of the things that Hume goes on to say in the subsequent discussion in this essay on miracles. He has a part 1 and a part 2. And everything I've been talking about concerns part 1. But in part 2, he does go on to give some reasons for thinking that in practice, the quality of testimony to miracles is not very good. And I think it's worth looking at each of these briefly. So one thing that Hume says is that miraculous testimony more often originates in ignorant and barbarous people groups, as he puts it, and hence can be ignored. Now, this is one that I don't think many modern philosophers are going to want to take up. Hume was living at a time, and he's a man of his time. He was living in the 18th century, and unfortunately, he does, to be frank, have quite racist attitudes, I think. And this was a common attitude among European intellectuals of his time. So I don't think there's any mileage to be had in this type of consideration. Here's something else Hume says that may have a bit more to it. So he says that the miracle claims of different religions cancel each other out. Potentially this is more interesting, but I would just note something that Hume doesn't notice. It does require the assumption that if there's a God, then that God would only ever perform miracles for the followers of the true religion, as it were. And different ways of understanding God are going to have different things to say about that question. A third thing Hume says is that humans have a natural tendency to love surprise and wonder, and that this should make us suspicious of miracle claims. Now, I think there's something to this, right? This does seem significant. Humans do seem to love fantastic tales and things that inspire awe and wonder. We do seem to be drawn to tales of the fantastic, and so I think Hume's right. We do need to proceed with caution. And Hume's cautionary note might be taken to suggest that the best kind of miracle testimony is going to come from witnesses whom we're fairly sure have nothing to gain from their testimony and a lot to lose from it. And of course, that might have some relevance to thinking about the Christian claim about the resurrection and the situation, the context that those early Christians found themselves in. Now, I've been fairly critical of Hume, and I've argued that his in-principle argument, what he calls his everlasting check against all kinds of superstition, doesn't work. Does that mean it's just a free-for-all? Well, no, I don't think so. And as I've said, I do think that some of Hume's considerations about miracle testimony in practice are useful. Clearly, we do want to set the bar high, even if not impossibly high. So I think we want to be simultaneously open-minded, but use our critical faculties. And I think some of the things Hume says helpfully point us in that direction. Now, I said that I don't think Hume's in-principle argument works, but I think something that he does rightly draw our attention to is that when we're thinking about whether a miracle claim is credible, it's not just a question of how good the evidence is. It's not just a question of how credible the testimony is, or if we're thinking about modern day claims, it's not just a question of how good, let's say, the photographic evidence is, and so on. it is also about the intrinsic probability of the event, or what we could, I didn't use this term before, the prior probability. That's a commonly used term. And okay, even if Hume is wrong that miracles are always so improbable that no amount of evidence could overcome them, I think what Hume does rightly draw our attention to is that our prior assumptions about the type of universe we're living in, our worldviews or our metaphysical picture of what reality is like, whether we think that there's a God who might be interested in intervening in human history, these questions can't just be bracketed when we're thinking about questions like whether Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. And this gentleman here, Dale C. Allison, he's a very esteemed New Testament scholar. He's an author I really admire. I think he has a great deal of intellectual honesty in the way he writes. He is a Christian, but he talks very openly about his doubts and his kind of wrestling. And he's written two very hefty, very scholarly and meticulously argued books on the resurrection. And what he wants to say, one of the key points he wants to make is that it's not just about the direct historical evidence, the evidence which seems to suggest that the tomb of Jesus probably was empty on the first Easter Sunday morning, and that no doubt the disciples did have experiences that made them think Jesus had risen from the dead. But it's not going to be a kind of slam dunk, in favor of the resurrection on the basis of the historical data alone. Because, as Hume has drawn our attention to, it's also a question of the intrinsic probabilities. And that ties into a much bigger discussion about what kind of universe do we think we're living in. And this is and I'll end here with this quotation from Allison. He says, the resurrection is not a topic unto itself. What he really means by that is the discussion about the historical data concerning Jesus' alleged resurrection. The resurrection is not a topic unto itself, and we cannot evaluate it independently of our evaluation of Christianity and the nature of the world. Easter faith sits in the middle of a controversy concerning the nature of reality at large. Just as a particular moral judgment can't be made without reference to a larger moral vision, so a verdict about the resurrection of Jesus cannot be made without reference to a larger theological vision or lack thereof. Well, thank you so much for being a very patient and gracious audience. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Max. Thank you. We'll move to a question time now. If you sit over there. Yeah, I will take that, Randy. And while you think of your question, and then pluck up the courage to stand at one of the microphones in the aisle, let me ask you a question, just to get us going. What do Oxford philosophers do? Some might be thinking you sit under oak trees and think about thinking or something.
Yeah.
But tell me about your
What
day
does
job.
my day-to-day look like? Well, so I guess my job broadly divides into teaching and research. So in terms of teaching, I teach undergraduates, and in the Oxford system, there's basically two formats that teaching has. So one would be kind of like this in a big lecture theatre. But then there's also the tutorial, where the students have written maybe a sort of 8-page paper, research paper, each week, and they'll come and discuss it. Normally they'll have a tutorial partner and other students, so they'll be in a pair, and I'll just kind of tear into their essays. No, I try and be kind. But then I also supervise some PhD students. And then in terms of research, I work on journal articles and books. And yeah, this topic is one of the sorts of topic that I've written on. You alluded to earlier that I've also written on the hiddenness of God, these questions to do with, well, if there is a God, why isn't it just really obvious? Why do we even have to debate this? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not sure if students were horrified when they heard that you have to do an 8-page essay each week, that you sit down in a room and get grilled by your tutor, and what's worse, you don't get a grade for it.
Right.
It's just gone. It's just gone. Yeah?
It's all formative.
It's all formative. A question. Thank you.
So, yeah, hi, my name is Steve. It's interesting, I invited someone to this lecture tonight, a Roman Catholic that I work with, and he said, "Fancy, you're inviting me to a talk on miracles." He pulls that book out of his bag, and he says, "I'm reading this book about miracles in the Roman Catholic Church. Authentic and inauthentic miracle stories." Mm-hmm. So my question for you is, have you researched or looked into any miracle stories from contemporary days?
A little bit. Yes.
And what have you found in terms of the strength of the testimony versus the improbability of the events?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so my main exposure to research on contemporary miracle claims is through the work of Craig Keener, who I mentioned earlier. So yes, I mean, it's worth saying that there is actually a fairly well agreed upon set of criteria that the Roman Catholic Church uses, and I think other Christians can make use of it too, because it's pretty sensible. And the gist of it is that the event, if it's an alleged healing, it has to be a condition where all our medical knowledge tells us this is not a condition that could just spontaneously recover. And then the apparent cure, relief, or recovery from it has to happen instantaneously and in the context of someone praying for it, right? And the third thing is it has to be permanent. So yeah, I will say that I'm fairly cautious about modern day miracle claims, because I do think there's a lot of claims that get made that I don't think meet that bar. But yeah, I do think that some of the cases that Craig Keener presents are good candidates for meeting that bar. So one that comes to mind is that there was a guy who, for some reason I can't remember, lost a large portion of his intestine, I think. And so this is clearly not something that, according to any of our medical knowledge, should just be able to recover spontaneously. And he was prayed for. He reported feeling some kind of sensation like an electrical current. And after that, they found that he had a functioning intestine again. I don't know if he'd got all of it back, as it were, but he could, digest his food again without any kind of help. And this was corroborated by before and after medical imagery and so on. And there are actually quite a lot of cases like that. Another case I'll just briefly mention was a woman who had blindness for years, and imagery of the retinas showed profound scarring on the retinas, right? Then one day her husband just prays for her, and she reports immediately being able to see again. And then there was again imagery of the retina showing a healthy retina. So those look like cases that are I would think, quite good candidates. I will say I think that those are rare, as far as I can tell. The types of claims that I more normally hear in church are ones where I, of course, want to be grateful that the person's recovered, but they could be explained naturalistically. Yeah.
Thank you. Question.
Great. So it seems that people who are honestly exploring the Christian faith may be concerned about being duped. So
Yeah.
and you explained the miracle of someone being healed, and we of course we'll nod our heads and say, oh, that's very nice, but then we'll go into the other room and there's a concern around, am I being duped or being silly?
Yeah.
And certainly we don't want to say everything's plausible. So what are the fair filters when measuring out is a miracle fair to assume is probably likely?
Well, yeah, so I mean, not to repeat myself too much, but I think those three criteria I mentioned just now are very helpful. Maybe I could add a little bit more, though. I do think I in general, am very cautious about, what's the right way to put this? Individuals or ministries that kind of are promoting themselves through claims about miracle healings. And the cases that I think are more credible, the ones that keener foregrounds are ones where they don't happen in the context of some healing ministry, if you like. It's more just this person thought, well, why not pray for healing, nothing to lose sort of thing. So, and why would we be more cautious about claims in that context? Well, I think Hume has kind of put his finger on it. We are drawn as humans to sort of awe and wonder, and the idea that there's a particular person who we might be able to show up to their rally or something like that, and that there'll be these sorts of events going on is something that we're inclined to believe, even if there's not really great evidence for it. But of course, also I think unfortunately there can be kind of selfish motives coming into play, particularly through the way that certain people might want to promote themselves. And it can be harmful, of course, and there's no doubt, I think, that this has been harmful, for example, in some contexts, let's say in Africa, where people are told that they don't need to take their medication anymore, and actually they weren't healed. So yeah, those would be some extra considerations I would bring to bear.
Thank you. Question.
Thank you, Dr. Vicker-Hitch. Appreciate the accessibility to Hume. It's very well done. I think my question, it plays off of that a little bit in regard to the connection between plausibility, when something moves from plausibility to truth.
Yeah.
And I was sharing this lecture with someone this evening, and they recalled a quote by Einstein. I don't know if this is Einstein, but it's an interesting quote regardless. There are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is though everything is a miracle. Do you agree with that binary? And maybe in the process of that, how would you define what a miracle is? What exactly are we talking about?
Thank you. Okay, I've not heard that quote before. So I think the most charitable way to take that is that Einstein is not using miracle in the way that I've been using it. So I should say something a bit more about what I mean by a miracle. So I think the best definition I've come across is one that basically goes back to Thomas Aquinas, which says that a miracle is an event that nature doesn't have the power to produce at the time and place where it occurs. So in other words, let's say, an object that kind of hovers in midair, if it's released, if nature was just left to itself, that object would fall to the ground. And so something extra from outside the system is going to need to come in order for an event like that to happen. It's actually not saying that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. I think that I don't like that definition, and that's not just because Hume gave it and he's not a theist. There are atheist philosophers also who think that that's not quite the right way to define it. So J.L. Mackie is an Australian atheist philosopher who said that actually all laws of nature implicitly have a kind of proviso that nature works this way, brackets, if left to itself. So a miracle would be a case where that bracket that proviso in the brackets doesn't apply. So it's not actually a violation of the laws of nature, but it is something that nature, if left to itself, couldn't bring about. So that's how I would define a miracle. But I think there is this, so our English word miracle sort of has its etymology in the Latin word miraculum, which can mean something like wonder. And so I think Einstein's using the term miracle to mean something more like a wondrous thing. Like some people, we might refer to the birth of a baby as a miracle, and I don't think we mean it's a miracle in that Thomas Aquinas sense that I just defined. And I think it's legitimate. I mean, I don't think we should go around policing language. Language does, ordinary words often do have more than one sense. I think Einstein's use of the word miracle is legitimate there. So in that sense, I think that quote is fine. But I don't think that we should take him to mean a miracle in the way I've been talking about it. But yeah, thank you for the question.
I mean, it's interesting, the word miracle hardly ever appears in the Bible. The word miraculum hardly ever in the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible. And you know, the words for what we call miracles, the things Jesus did in the Gospels, are powers and signs. What do you make of that oddity? That actually, it's not even biblical language to say they're miracles.
Exactly. I mean, here's the thing. We so often talk nowadays about the supernatural and the natural. And I do have a bit of a problem with that way of talking. It's sort of useful in a way, and I understand why we use it, but the problem I have with it is it depicts reality as a two-story house in a way. Like, nature is the base, is the ground floor, and God lives upstairs, and he might occasionally come downstairs and move some stuff around and then go back upstairs again. And that's the supernatural coming in. But I mean, you know much more about this than I do, John. I don't get the impression that's what the biblical authors think is going on. And as you said, yeah, the word supernatural is not, there is no term that could legitimately be translated as supernatural in the Bible. So I think we are slightly hamstrung in our modern context by that concept of supernature.
Was there a question? Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Chris. I kind of have a question with just what you've been talking just now, kind of like in this scope. There are kind of two big church views about miracles that happen within the church. The first view is kind of like that Jesus and his closest disciples were the one who had the ability to kind of transmit heavenly power, if that makes sense, into the earthly miracles, and then the rest of us just don't have this power. Okay. And so as the other people, but there's another theory that every one of us has this intrinsic power. So like, as Jesus said, we're gonna receive the power of the Holy Spirit, and we're gonna do what Jesus did, and even more than that. I guess kind of like my question is like, what would you say about that? What would you say on the possibility of the miracles happening within contemporary church with just regular believers as us, especially within the scope of so many evangelists going around claiming to heal the sick?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So I think in a way what you might be asking is about whether there's a sort of office of a healer in the contemporary church. So I don't know what to think about that. I suppose I probably indicated earlier that I'm cautious about that idea. So that's different, though, from saying that miracles don't happen. As I also indicated, I think that there may be cases where people have prayed for healing and they really have received it. But yeah, I mean, there does seem to be this sense that Jesus commissions the apostles to do signs and wonders like he did, and Paul sort of alludes to this in his epistles at certain points. And the vibe you get is that they were doing these miraculous healings quite regularly. Paul even raises someone from the dead, I think, doesn't he? Eutychus, who falls out of a window.
From a very long talk.
Yeah, let's not keep this going too long. We don't want that to happen. So do we see that kind of sort of almost commissioning of people today for an almost apostolic role in which they're regularly going around healing people? That's, I will say, not something I've seen strong evidence for. And I would differentiate that from whether there's evidence for individual healings. But these cases, as I said, are just an ordinary believer who just happens to think, let's just ask God for healing. And that's so. Yeah, I'm a little bit cautious, in short, about whether there are people who regularly have a sort of gift of healing.
I want to ask you about the resurrection. Oh, is there a question? You standing up to ask a question, sir? Yeah, great, go for it, yeah. I was just going to ask a final question, but great that you're there.
Hello. You talked about scrutinizing the argument for miracles and how Hume talks about how miracles claim of different religions can cancel each other out. So then, given that different religious traditions present mutually exclusive miracle claims, how should people outside those traditions evaluate them?
Yeah.
And then is there a framework that non-believers of different faiths can use to assess those?
That's an excellent question. Well, the thing is that I think Hume is kind of right when he says that, the foundational miracles of different traditions cancel each other out. But I think where he's wrong is in thinking that the evidence for these foundational miracles is on a par. And the other thing to say is that of the major world religions, not many of them actually do claim that they were established as a result of a miracle. Now we have to be careful here. So Islam does claim that the Quran is a miracle, but it's not really clear that it's not clear to me that it's being claimed that it was a miracle in the sense that a person being raised from the dead would be a miracle. I guess Judaism is not, in that sense, Judaism is not a competitor to Christianity, right? Because suppose that the Exodus happened, the plagues and so on, all of that, the parting of the Red Sea, that in no way is in conflict with Christianity, right? So that's another nuance that Hume is missing. And then as for the Eastern traditions, I'm not by any means very qualified to talk about this, but as far as I understand, that they are not really predicated on the claim that miracles have happened in space and time. So I think when you actually then start to step back and ask, well, which miracles really do put forward these strong claims like Christianity does? I don't think that it's the case that most of them are doing this anyway. I think then we really do have to get into the nitty-gritty. So in terms of the composition of the Quran and so on, I suppose traditional Islam does want to claim that the Quran had no human involvement whatsoever in its production. It really was kind of divinely dictated. That is a claim we can scrutinize, right? And, I think mainstream kind of secular scholarship on the Quran is now getting underway in a way that it has been underway for kind of 200-300 years on the Bible. And yeah, it does look like the Quran has all sorts of hallmarks of human composition, oral tradition, the kind of hallmarks of traditions that are composed in oral settings and get modified, and even bits of apocryphal gospels being taken up and so on. So I think, and then in terms of Jesus' resurrection, I alluded to this a little bit, but I might be jumping the gun with what John's about to ask me. But I do think, even if it's not a slam dunk on the basis of the historical data alone, the evidence is much more compelling. And I think even a sober-minded secular scholar, someone like Giza Vermesh, would probably agree that the evidence for Jesus' resurrection it deserves to be taken seriously in a way that other miracle claims don't. So, yeah.
Thank you. There's a question there. We'll make this the last one.
Yes. So, first of all, thank you so much for the lecture. Second, so going back to your analogy of the cupcake.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So, using an analogy of following through, if we were to say that it would make sense to have that purple cupcake, we would have to have previous knowledge of a coworker up the line who loves you, who would care for your birthday. So to follow through that analogy, how would we know of this coworker, or in our analogy, God, if we do not have that cupcake or miracle that's already shown? Do we not already assume some divine revelation to even know that God exists?
Aha. Thank you. That's a great question. So I think one thing I would say firstly is I don't think you need to know that coworker likes you, knows your favorite color, and that it's your birthday. I think you could even have quite weak evidence. You've just heard a rumor, third, fourth hand, and that should raise your probability a bit that something unusual might happen today. So that's the first thing I'd say. I don't think we need certainty that this co-worker has this plan for you. All right. Then taking the analogy across to God, so this does get into a very fraught area in terms of whether we should use what theologians and philosophers would call natural theology. So kind of looking at the world and trying to see if it has the fingerprints of a creator on it. And so that would be a distinct path to trying to figure stuff out about God than kind of receiving a sort of special revelation from God. So, and that's, I alluded to this. Richard Swinburne has tried to say that, well, we can make inferences from the natural world, from things like the fine-tuning of the universe. I think John's going to have another talk in this series on that later on. Things like, our moral intuitions, consciousness, free will. Can we make inferences to the best explanation for some kind of God who has some kind of purposes for us? And as I said, we don't need to be certain that there's a God or no before that should start to, I think, increase our prior probability somewhat that that there might be some sort of intervention in history. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I am going to ask you to briefly give us your thoughts on the resurrection, bringing together, what you've said tonight and how that might meet with the actual evidence.
Yeah.
But I did just want to draw your attention to the next two in the Questioning Christianity series, and urge you to maybe invite a friend, especially if you have a friend who's a bit skeptical about all this. Next time at the end of October, Luke Barnes is a cosmologist. He's an expert in the origins of the universe, has written fine peer-reviewed literature on fine-tuning and conditions of the primal universe. And he's going to be talking about, well, was the cosmos expecting us? And then in December, we've got Rebecca McLaughlin, house favourite, coming back to talk to us about whether Christmas is believable. And again, if you've got friends maybe who are skeptical about the whole thing or just don't know what to make of Christian faith, we want this to be a forum where they can come, they can hear some interesting thoughts, throw any questions they want at the speaker, and as you've seen tonight, I'm very happy to take any questions that come our way. So that's that. I guess my question is, what do you make? I don't want you to try and become a historian, but I know you have read all of the important literature on the resurrection from the historical point of view. But can you bring your philosophical argument tonight to bear on that testimonial, that historical evidence?
Well, the thing I would say is that the different bits of the resurrection evidence, if you take them in isolation, you could say, we have other cases where there's a tomb that's found empty. We have other cases where someone's friend allegedly saw them come back from the dead. But the thing that is quite striking, and the scholar I quoted at the end, Dale Allison, who is sort of he is quite skeptical in some ways in the way he discusses this, but he says he doesn't know of a case where you get all of these different elements in one situation. So, namely, not just any sort of Joe Nobody, but this guy, Jesus, who has this extremely profound, I think most people would agree, extremely profound kind of moral teaching, lives this extremely kind of admirable, virtuous life. And then his tomb does seem, the evidence indicates, and I think this would be a responsible scholarly conclusion, that his tomb probably was found empty a couple of days after he was buried in it. And then that not just one or two of his followers kind of thought they saw him again, but multiple of his followers, and sometimes together at the same time. And not just that, but that they could have, I mean, you might think in theory they could have just said, well, they saw his ghost, or they saw his angel. That was something in Second Temple Judaism they might say about a dead person who appeared to them. They saw their angel. Or he's been translated into heaven like Elijah. But they didn't. They said that he had been resurrected, which was this very particular concept in Second Temple Judaism that is reserved for the righteous dead of Israel at the end of history. So it's a very niche, kind of unexpected choice of category to put it in, really. And so you get, as I said, if any of these bits in isolation might be relatively easy to pick off and say, yeah, well, sometimes bodies go missing, and that's just how it goes. It doesn't mean they're resurrected. But when you have all of this stuff coming together, and it's, as I said, not just Joe Nobody, it's this guy whose teaching has argued, I mean, Tom Holland, who John mentioned earlier, thinks, and I think he's made a strong case, that Jesus' moral teaching has shaped the West, profoundly up to the present day, and not just the West, much of the world. And all of this stuff coming together, that's what gives me pause. I wasn't always a Christian, but when I kind of started looking into it, that was, maybe it's not a slam dunk. I don't think we can be totally certain about really anything much, but that's the thing where I say, I don't think I can unsee that now and just turn away from it.
I'm certain my wife and daughter love me, but sure, you're a philosopher. Will you please thank Dr. Max Baker-Hyde?
Thanks, John.